Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe. We are so glad you are here with us today for another deep and thoughtful conversation. Each day, we take on a big topic that connects the world, politics, and power. And today, we have chosen one of the most important debates in international relations. The title of our discussion is U.S. Sanctions versus China's Money, Who Wins the Game? This is a question that affects not just governments, but the everyday lives of people around the world. And that is why we want to carefully explore it with you.
That's right, Adam. When we look at the world today, two forces stand out more than any others: the economic power of the United States and the financial rise of China. The US has long relied on economic sanctions, using its control of the global financial system to punish countries and shape their behavior. China, on the other hand, has poured money into trade, loans, and massive projects, using investment to expand its reach and influence. Both of these tools, sanctions and money, are powerful, but they work in very different ways. And the question is, which one has the bigger impact in the long run?
This topic is so important because it is not just about theory or politics. It is about how the world is being reshaped before our very eyes. If the U.S. sanctions are strong enough, they can isolate countries and push governments to change course. But if China's money is attractive enough, nations might prefer to ignore sanctions and instead welcome China's financial offers. This is not just about governments making choices. It is about roads being built, companies being closed, people losing jobs, or even new opportunities opening up. Every person listening today is somehow connected to this story, whether through trade, technology, or even the price of goods in their local market.
Exactly, Adam. And that is why we want to invite our listeners to be part of this conversation, not just by listening, but also by sharing your views. If you are watching this on YouTube, we would love it if you could click the like button and subscribe to the English Globe. That way, you will always be updated when we release a new discussion. It also helps us grow this community of people who are curious about the world and want to understand how global politics and economics shape our daily lives.
And please, dear listeners, do not forget to leave us a comment. Tell us where you are listening from, whether you are in Africa, Asia, Europe, the Middle East, or anywhere else. We want to hear from you. Every place has a different perspective on this topic, because some countries feel the weight of U.S. sanctions, while others feel the pull of Chinese money. Sharing your thoughts will help us understand the real human side of this debate. Do you believe sanctions are more powerful, or do you think money can win more friends than punishment? We are truly curious about your opinions.
The reason we think this is such a meaningful topic for discussion is because it reveals how power works in the 21st century. In the past, power was mostly about armies and wars. But today, it is also about money, trade, and finance. Sanctions are like invisible weapons. They do not involve soldiers, but they can hurt economies and change governments. China's money, on the other hand, works almost like a magnet, pulling countries closer with the promise of new highways, ports, and jobs. Understanding which of these forces is stronger tells us a lot about the future shape of our world.
As we go deeper into this podcast, Julia and I will take you through examples, history, and real-life stories. We will talk about Africa, Asia, and Europe. We will look at how sanctions have been used by the United States and how China has used its money to win influence. We want this to be a learning journey, not just for you, but also for us, because this debate is still unfolding. Nobody can say with complete certainty who wins this game, but by the end of this podcast, you will have a much clearer picture of how both strategies work, what their strengths are, and what their weaknesses are.
So once again, dear listeners, welcome to the English Globe. We are grateful to have you here with us. Please remember to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment telling us where you are tuning in from and what you think about today's topic. Is it sanctions that shape the world more, or is it money that buys power and influence? That is the big question, and we are going to explore it together. So sit back, stay with us, and let's dive into this journey step by step.
When we talk about the global power of the United States, many people first think about its military or its culture. But one of the most significant tools of American power since the end of the Second World War has been economic sanctions. Sanctions are restrictions placed on countries, companies, or individuals to punish certain actions and push them to change behavior, and they have been central to U.S. foreign policy since the Cold War. What makes sanctions so powerful is not only the size of the American economy, but also the fact that the U.S. dollar remains the most important currency in the world, and most international trade and banking systems are connected to it.
That's right, Adam. And when we look back at history, we can see how often the United States has used sanctions as a substitute for war. Instead of sending troops, Washington has frozen bank accounts, blocked exports, restricted oil sales, and cut off access to international finance. During the Cold War, the US used sanctions against the Soviet Union and its allies, trying to weaken their economies and limit their global influence. After the Cold War, sanctions became even more common, especially in cases where the US wanted to show power without committing military forces. Countries such as Cuba, North Korea, and Iraq were placed under long-term sanctions that reshaped their economies and societies.
Sanctions can be very broad, targeting an entire nation, or very narrow, focused on individuals or companies. One of the best-known examples is the sanctions placed on Iran. For decades, the U.S. has used sanctions to pressure Iran over its nuclear program, restricting its ability to sell oil, access foreign investment, and use international banks. These sanctions have cut Iran off from billions of dollars and have made it extremely difficult for its economy to grow. Another famous example is Venezuela, where sanctions on its oil sector and government officials were designed to weaken the power of President Nicolás Maduro. By limiting Venezuela's access to financial systems, the U.S. tried to create economic pressure that could push political change.
And of course, we cannot forget the case of Russia. After Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, the United States, along with its European allies, placed sanctions on Russian banks, companies, and government officials. These sanctions were expanded even further after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. They included restrictions on Russian banks accessing the global financial system, limits on technology exports, and even the freezing of foreign assets belonging to Russian billionaires. What makes these sanctions so powerful is the central role of the US in the global financial network. Almost every country and every major corporation needs access to the dollar and to US-controlled banking systems to trade internationally.
That is why sanctions are often described as a kind of financial weapon. If a country is locked out of the U.S. dollar system, it becomes extremely hard for it to buy or sell goods on a large scale. Imagine a country trying to sell its oil but unable to receive payments in dollars, or a bank trying to send money abroad but blocked from using the international financial messaging system known as SWIFT. This is the reality that many countries under sanctions face, and it shows why sanctions are often more effective than traditional forms of punishment. They do not require military action, yet they can still cripple an economy and put enormous pressure on governments to change course.
But Adam, it is also important to understand that sanctions are not only about economics. They are also about symbolism and politics. When the US sanctions a country, it is sending a message to the world that a certain behavior is unacceptable. For example, in the case of Iran, the sanctions were not only about stopping the nuclear program, but also about signaling to other countries that pursuing nuclear weapons would bring heavy consequences. Similarly, in the case of Russia, sanctions are meant to show that aggression against another sovereign state will not go unpunished. In this way, sanctions are both a practical tool and a form of political communication.
Absolutely, Julia. And one of the reasons U.S. sanctions have been so effective over time is because of the sheer size of the American economy. The US dollar accounts for more than half of all global reserves, and most international trade contracts are written in dollars. This means that even companies in Europe, Asia, or Africa cannot easily ignore US rules if they want to do business. If a company trades with a sanctioned country, it risks losing access to American markets and banks, which is usually a far greater cost than losing business with the sanctioned nation. In this way, the US has extended its influence far beyond its borders, making sanctions one of its most powerful foreign policy weapons.
What makes this even more interesting is how other countries respond to sanctions. For example, in Iran, sanctions created huge difficulties for ordinary citizens, from inflation to shortages of medicines. In Venezuela, sanctions worsened an already collapsing economy, leading to food shortages and mass migration. And in Russia, sanctions have forced the government to look for alternatives to the dollar, turning toward China and other partners. Some critics argue that sanctions hurt ordinary people more than leaders, but others say they are necessary to send a strong message and limit the resources of governments that act against international law. This tension is what makes the debate about sanctions so complex and so important.
The effectiveness of sanctions also depends on how many countries cooperate with the US. If America acts alone, sanctions can still be powerful, but when it builds alliances with Europe, Japan, and others, the impact becomes much stronger. In the case of Russia, for example, the combined sanctions from the US and the European Union have had a major effect on trade, technology, and financial systems. However, countries like China have sometimes provided an escape route, allowing sanctioned nations to survive by trading outside the Western financial system. This is why the rise of China is such a challenge to the US. It creates an alternative for countries that are punished by sanctions.
So when we think about sanctions, we see both their strengths and their limits. On the one hand, they are incredibly powerful because they use the central role of the US dollar to cut countries off from the world economy. On the other hand, their effectiveness can be reduced if alternative systems grow strong enough to replace US-led networks. But even with these challenges, there is no doubt that sanctions remain one of the most important and effective tools of American foreign policy. They allow the US to influence global politics without direct military action, and they show how financial power can be just as impactful as weapons on the battlefield. When we look at China's approach to power in the world, it becomes clear that Beijing has chosen a path very different from Washington, because instead of punishing countries with sanctions, it has offered money, investment, and trade deals that build relationships through opportunity rather than fear. And this strategy has allowed China to reach into regions that once felt ignored by Western powers.
The centerpiece of this strategy is the Belt and Road Initiative, which was officially launched by President Xi Jinping in 2013 as a plan to connect Asia, Africa, Europe, and even Latin America through railways, highways, ports, pipelines, and digital networks. And by financing these projects, China has positioned itself not only as a trading partner, but also as a development leader that many nations now see as essential.
One of the reasons this diplomacy works so well is that many developing countries cannot easily access money from Western banks or global institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, because those organizations attach strict conditions to their loans, while China usually offers financing with fewer political demands, making it an attractive partner for leaders who need quick results.
What makes the Belt and Road Initiative so powerful is not just the amount of money involved, but also the way these projects are structured, because when China builds a railway or a port, it often brings Chinese workers, Chinese companies, and Chinese technology, which means the borrowing country becomes dependent on Beijing in ways that go far beyond the original loan.
We can already see the results of this in places like Africa, where China has built railways in Kenya, dams in Ethiopia, and ports in Djibouti, while in Asia, it has invested heavily in Pakistan's roads and power plants, and in Europe it has financed projects in Greece and Italy, showing that money diplomacy is not limited by geography, but stretches across continents.
At the same time, critics argue that China is practicing what they call debt trap diplomacy, which means lending money in such large amounts that countries cannot pay it back, forcing them to surrender control of strategic assets, and the most famous case is Sri Lanka, where the Hambantota port was leased to a Chinese company for 99 years after the government failed to meet its debt obligations.
Supporters of China's model, however, say that the debt trap story is exaggerated and that Beijing is simply offering financing that others refuse to provide, while it is the responsibility of borrowing countries to manage their money wisely. And from their perspective, the choice is between stagnation without loans or progress with China's help, even if it comes at a cost.
What cannot be denied is that China's Belt and Road Initiative has already tied more than 140 countries into its network, with trillions of dollars committed to different projects. And this scale of money power is something the world has rarely seen, because it is reshaping trade routes, political loyalties, and even the balance of power between the East and the West.
Compared to US sanctions, which work by isolating countries from the financial system, China's money diplomacy works by bringing them closer into its orbit, giving access to infrastructure and trade that many governments desperately need. And for leaders who want to show new roads, new ports, and new jobs to their people, Beijing's offers are difficult to resist.
This is why the Belt and Road Initiative is often described not just as an economic project, but as China's vision for a new world order, because through loans, investments, and construction, Beijing is placing itself at the center of global trade and influence, using money as a tool that is just as powerful as military might, or sanctions in shaping the future of international politics. When we talk about global power, we often see two very different tools being used. The United States tends to rely on sanctions, which are forms of punishment. Sanctions restrict access to the US dollar, banking systems, and even trade opportunities. They are designed to control behavior by creating pain for the targeted country. In this sense, sanctions are about punishment and control rather than cooperation.
That's a very important point, Adam. On the other side, China often takes the opposite approach. Instead of punishment, China uses money and investment to build influence. This strategy offers rewards and incentives. Through loans, infrastructure projects, and trade deals, China provides tangible benefits. A country that works with China gets new roads, ports, or factories. So while the US says, if you misbehave, we punish you, China says, if you cooperate, we reward you.
The difference between punishment and reward is fundamental. Sanctions create fear, while money diplomacy creates hope. But there is also a question of effectiveness. Sanctions may push countries to change, but they also create resentment. Leaders under sanctions often blame the United States for economic problems. This can make citizens angry at America instead of angry at their own government. In that way, sanctions can sometimes backfire politically.
Exactly. And with China's approach, the story is more complex. Many nations welcome Chinese money because it fills gaps that Western countries don't address. For example, African nations have received billions for roads, hospitals, and railways. These projects create jobs and improve daily life. But at the same time, some critics argue that Chinese loans can create dependency. When countries cannot repay, China may gain political leverage over them. So the incentive comes with hidden strings.
So we see a balance here. Sanctions are a stick, and money is a carrot. Both tools aim to shape behavior, but in different ways. The United States often uses sanctions to protect global norms, such as stopping nuclear weapons or punishing aggression. Meanwhile, China uses money to expand influence, strengthen trade, and gain political support in international organizations. The choice of tool reflects not just strategy, but also each country's vision of leadership.
That's true, Adam. But we should also ask, which one works better in practice? Sanctions can isolate countries like Iran and Venezuela, cutting them off from world markets. Yet those governments are still in power. On the other hand, Chinese investments have won friends across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But some of those friends are now questioning the long-term costs of working with China. So neither approach is perfect, and both carry risks.
Another factor is perception. Sanctions make the U.S. appear strong but also harsh. To many nations, America looks like a global police officer, telling others what they cannot do. China, on the other hand, presents itself as a partner, offering development and opportunity. This softer image is powerful in diplomacy. Many leaders prefer to be courted with money rather than threatened with punishment. Image matters, and incentives often look more attractive than control.
Yet incentives also raise suspicions. Some nations wonder if China's generosity hides long-term ambitions. For instance, in Sri Lanka, the government could not repay Chinese loans, so it leased a major port to China for 99 years. That deal raised alarms about sovereignty and dependency. While the short-term reward was new infrastructure, the long-term result was reduced independence. So what seems like a gift can sometimes feel like a trap.
That's a sharp example, Julia. But sanctions also have unintended consequences. When Russia faced U.S. sanctions after Crimea in 2014, instead of giving in, it turned toward China and built stronger ties there. In other words, punishment sometimes pushes countries to look for new friends. That can weaken U.S. influence in the long run. Instead of isolating a nation, sanctions can drive it into the arms of America's rivals.
This brings us to an important question. Which tool actually wins more allies? Sanctions can force short-term compliance, but they rarely create lasting friendship. No country wants to feel bullied. By contrast, China's rewards may create long-term partnerships, but those partnerships can sour if debt becomes overwhelming. So both methods have limits. Neither punishment nor incentive alone can fully secure loyalty. True influence may require a mix of strategies.
And that mix is where future competition will unfold. Imagine a country in Africa or South America deciding between the U.S. and China. If the U.S. threatens sanctions for certain policies, but China offers billions in investment, who looks more appealing? In many cases, money wins hearts faster than punishment changes behavior. This is why China's rise has been so rapid in the past 2 decades. Rewards feel better than restrictions.
Still, let's not forget values. Many countries look to America not just for economic ties, but for ideals like democracy, human rights, and rule of law. Sanctions are often linked to those principles. When the US punishes a regime for violating rights, it sends a moral message. China, by contrast, usually avoids moral judgments and focuses only on business. That makes its incentives attractive, but also raises questions about what kind of world order China wants to build.
So in the end, sanctions and incentives are not just tools. They are reflections of philosophy. The U.S. approach says rules must be respected, and breaking them has costs. The Chinese approach says cooperation brings opportunity, and working together has benefits. Both strategies carry weight, but each shapes a different kind of global system. The future may depend on which vision more countries find compelling, one of control or one of reward.
That's the real competition, Adam. And it's not only about governments. Ordinary people also feel these tools. When sanctions cut off medicine or food supplies, citizens suffer. When Chinese investments build schools or railways, communities see direct change. But when debts pile up, those same communities may feel trapped. In global politics, the lives of everyday people often reveal the real effects of control versus incentive.
Exactly, Julia. That's why this comparison is so important. Sanctions may achieve short-term goals, but they often damage America's reputation. Chinese incentives may win influence, but they risk creating new dependencies. Both tools are powerful, both tools are dangerous, and both tools will continue shaping international politics. The question is not which tool is stronger, but which tool builds a more stable and cooperative world.
And that's where we'll leave this section. Control versus incentive, punishment versus reward. The US and China are playing very different games. The challenge for smaller nations is choosing which game to join, or how to balance between both.
When we look at Africa, it becomes clear that US sanctions have had very limited impact on shaping political outcomes. The US has tried to pressure governments across the continent with sanctions, often targeting regimes accused of corruption, human rights abuses, or ties with terrorist groups. But the truth is, these sanctions rarely achieve the desired change. Many African states simply look elsewhere for support, which undermines the effectiveness of US power.
For example, sanctions on Zimbabwe in the early 2000s were meant to isolate Robert Mugabe's government and weaken his grip on power. Instead, the sanctions did little to topple his regime. They mostly hurt ordinary citizens who faced rising inflation, job losses, and shortages. Over time, Zimbabwe's government deepened ties with countries like China and Russia, finding new partners who were willing to ignore Western pressure. This pattern highlights the limits of US tools in Africa.
Sanctions work best when the targeted state relies heavily on Western financial systems, especially the US dollar. But many African countries are less tied to Wall Street than countries in Europe or Asia. When the US tries to cut off access to banks or markets, African leaders often find ways to bypass restrictions. They seek loans from non-Western partners, sell resources in alternative markets, or trade through less regulated channels. This weakens Washington's leverage in the region.
In contrast, China's role in Africa has grown dramatically, and it is not based on punishment, but on offering opportunities. Through investment, loans, and infrastructure projects, China has presented itself as a reliable partner. Unlike the US, which often attaches conditions about democracy or human rights, China's approach is more straightforward. Beijing offers money, builds roads, and opens markets without asking too many questions about how governments behave domestically.
The Belt and Road Initiative is central to this transformation. Across Africa, China has funded ports, highways, railways, and power plants. From Kenya's standard gauge railway to Ethiopia's massive industrial parks, China has reshaped the physical landscape of the continent. For many African leaders, this is a tangible benefit. People see new infrastructure rising, which creates jobs and promises future growth. In comparison, sanctions feel abstract and destructive, while Chinese money feels visible and constructive.
China has also become Africa's largest lender. Billions of dollars flow into loans for governments that need cash quickly for development. Some see this as a blessing. African countries can build cities, airports, and communication networks without waiting for slow Western aid. Others, however, warn that this creates dependency. When nations cannot repay loans, China sometimes gains leverage over strategic assets, like ports or mineral rights. This is why critics describe China's influence as a form of new colonialism.
That debate is important. African leaders often defend their ties to China by arguing that they finally have choices. For decades, the West dominated aid and investment in Africa, and that came with heavy strings attached. Today, African countries can balance between different partners. Still, there are risks. China's loans can trap countries in cycles of debt, leaving them vulnerable to Beijing's pressure. Meanwhile, US sanctions still exist, but they don't create much loyalty. This creates a complicated balance of power.
Let's take an example. Ethiopia. For years, Ethiopia was one of Africa's fastest-growing economies. Western aid played a role, but Chinese loans and construction projects were critical. When Ethiopia faced conflict in its northern regions, the US threatened sanctions to push for peace and accountability. But the Ethiopian government leaned on China and other partners for support, reducing the effectiveness of American threats. This shows how US sanctions lose power when China offers an alternative path.
The U.S. faces another challenge: public perception. In many African countries, sanctions are seen as punishment not only for governments, but also for citizens. They create resentment toward Washington. On the other hand, Chinese projects, new bridges, hospitals, and technology networks are often celebrated in local media. People see visible progress linked to Chinese involvement, while U.S. sanctions seem to bring only hardship. Winning hearts and minds requires more than threats, and here, America struggles.
However, not all Africans see China as a benevolent partner. Critics warn that China's influence often benefits elites more than ordinary citizens. Large infrastructure projects sometimes employ Chinese workers instead of locals. Loans create long-term financial burdens, and the quality of construction is sometimes questioned. In Zambia, for example, rising debt to China has sparked political debates about sovereignty. Some argue that while China builds, it also binds African countries in ways that limit their independence.
Exactly, and that is where the case study of Africa becomes so fascinating. On one side, the U.S. approach of sanctions has limited power, often backfiring and pushing countries toward alternative partners. On the other, China's money diplomacy creates growth but raises fears of dependency and neocolonialism. African states are not passive. They weigh these options carefully, choosing what they believe serves their national interests. But the contrast between U.S. control and Chinese incentives is clearer here than anywhere else.
In the end, the African case highlights a broader truth. Global influence today is not just about military might or sanctions. It is about building trust, showing results, and offering partnerships that people can see and feel. The US struggles because sanctions are invisible and negative. China succeeds, at least in the short term, because its money diplomacy is visible and positive. Whether this will last is uncertain. But Africa remains the testing ground for this great power competition. When we turn to the Asia-Pacific region, the story looks very different from Africa. In Southeast Asia, China has positioned itself as the central hub of trade. Countries like Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia now count China as their largest trading partner. This didn't happen by accident. China used its growing economy, cheap manufacturing, and strategic investments to build deep connections. Trade here is not just about buying and selling, it is about trust and long-term dependence.
Exactly, Julia. And if we contrast that with U.S. policy in Asia, especially toward countries like North Korea, we see a very different method at play. Instead of offering trade or investment, Washington has often relied on sanctions. North Korea has faced decades of U.S. and international sanctions aimed at stopping its nuclear weapons program. These sanctions isolate Pyongyang, cutting off its access to global markets. In this case, the U.S. isn't offering friendship, but enforcing control through punishment.
That's the key difference. China is offering carrots, while the US is showing sticks. For countries in Southeast Asia, the carrot approach feels much more attractive. When Chinese companies build railways in Laos or invest in ports in Cambodia, the people there see new jobs and opportunities. They see physical evidence of growth. On the other hand, US sanctions in Asia are invisible to ordinary people. They see restrictions, tension, and confrontation, rather than cooperation.
But let's not forget, Julia, that sanctions can also shape regional politics in indirect ways. For example, the sanctions on North Korea don't just affect Pyongyang. They also put pressure on countries like China, South Korea, and Japan to think carefully about their strategies. Sanctions force regional players to take sides and align with the U.S. position. So, while China is building loyalty through trade, the U.S. is trying to build loyalty through shared security threats and enforcement.
True, but we should also ask, which loyalty is stronger? Loyalty born from dependence on trade and investment, or loyalty born from pressure to follow sanctions? Many Southeast Asian countries prefer China's method because it is non-confrontational. They don't want to choose sides in a power struggle. They want prosperity, and China provides it. That is why China's trade dominance feels so natural in this region. It makes countries less willing to challenge Beijing.
Still, there's another angle here. Sanctions may not bring prosperity, but they do create unity against dangerous actors. For example, without sanctions, North Korea might have even more advanced weapons today. That threat would destabilize the whole region. So, the US argues that its sanctions help keep peace by limiting Pyongyang's power. Some Asian allies like Japan and South Korea value this approach. They see US sanctions not as punishment for them, but as protection.
And that shows the divide in Asia-Pacific. On one side, countries that prioritize security, like Japan and South Korea, lean toward the US because of its sanctions and military alliances. On the other side, countries that prioritize growth and development, like Cambodia, Laos, and even Malaysia, lean toward China because of its trade and money. This split shows us that both methods, sanctions and money, have influence, but they attract very different types of loyalty.
Yes, and this leads to a fascinating question. Which kind of loyalty is more sustainable in the long term? Security-driven loyalty can fade if the threat changes. If North Korea suddenly collapsed or became peaceful, the value of US sanctions would disappear overnight. But trade-driven loyalty builds over decades. As supply chains become more integrated, as factories and ports are built, it becomes much harder for countries to turn away from China.
That's why many analysts describe Asia-Pacific as the true testing ground of this rivalry. Here we can see both strategies side by side. The US is tightening sanctions and strengthening security networks, while China is expanding its economic footprint. Countries in the middle must constantly balance. Do they join the US in sanctioning North Korea, or do they join China in building roads and ports? In practice, many try to do both, but the pull of money is often stronger.
And that balance is tricky. For example, Vietnam has a complicated relationship with China. On one hand, China is its largest trading partner. On the other hand, they have territorial disputes in the South China Sea. Vietnam still works with the US to balance Chinese influence, but even then, it cannot escape dependence on Chinese markets. This shows how powerful economic tools can be. Even when countries dislike certain policies, they still cannot walk away from the trade benefits. Exactly. The Asia-Pacific is full of such contradictions. Cambodia is openly pro-China because of heavy investments in infrastructure. Meanwhile, the Philippines swings back and forth, sometimes leaning toward China for trade, sometimes leaning toward the US for security. It proves that the region is not fully owned by either side. Instead, it's a competition of tools, control versus incentive, sanctions versus trade, and every country makes choices based on its own needs. And if we think about the bigger picture, Asia-Pacific shows us that no single method works everywhere. The US cannot simply sanction its way to influence in Southeast Asia, and China cannot simply buy its way into North Korea. Each strategy has strengths and weaknesses. The real question is, which strategy will win more allies over the next decade? Will countries prioritize prosperity, or will they prioritize protection?
That is the heart of the debate. In Southeast Asia, prosperity seems to be winning. China's trade numbers are rising year after year, while the US struggles to match that kind of economic engagement. But in Northeast Asia, protection seems to be stronger. US sanctions, military alliances, and shared security goals keep South Korea and Japan firmly in Washington's camp. The Asia-Pacific is therefore a divided region, shaped by two very different kinds of power.
And perhaps this division itself is the lesson. The US and China are not simply competing in one single way. They are using opposite strategies in the same region, and both are working, just with different countries. This makes the Asia-Pacific not just a case study, but a mirror of the wider global rivalry. It shows us that influence can come from punishment or from reward. Which one lasts longer? Only time will tell. When we turn to Europe, the focus shifts to a very different set of dynamics, because here we see both U.S. sanctions and Chinese investments operating simultaneously, and the United States has used its sanctions against Russia to influence European behavior for years, requiring countries to limit energy imports, restrict financial transactions, and align foreign policies with Washington, which places significant pressure on governments across the continent to act in concert with American priorities. The sanctions imposed on Russia after events like the annexation of Crimea in 2014 or the conflict in Ukraine have been designed to target Russian banks, oligarchs, and key industries. But they also indirectly affect European economies because many European companies are closely tied to Russian energy, trade, and investment, creating a complicated situation where Europe must balance its economic interests with political loyalty to the U.S., making sanctions a tool not only against Russia, but also to shape European decision-making. These measures force European states into difficult choices: comply fully with U.S. sanctions and risk economic hardship at home, or attempt to resist American pressure and risk political friction with a key ally. Countries like Germany and Italy have faced criticism for energy dependence on Russia while still trying to adhere to sanctions, illustrating the limits of U.S. influence and how sanctions, even when powerful, must contend with economic realities, which can weaken their effectiveness if alternatives are not available or feasible.
In contrast, China has approached Europe through what we often call money diplomacy, focusing particularly on Eastern Europe, ports, and infrastructure. Countries in the Balkans and Central Europe have welcomed Chinese investments in highways, railways, and energy projects, seeing them as opportunities to modernize infrastructure and attract business without political conditions attached. This approach provides immediate benefits, creating jobs, improving logistics, and expanding trade networks, which makes Chinese involvement highly visible and appealing to local governments.
The ports in Greece, particularly the Piraeus port, are a prime example. China has invested heavily, modernized facilities, and turned them into one of the largest shipping hubs in Europe. These investments not only serve Chinese trade interests, but also benefit Greece by creating employment and stimulating the economy. Similar projects in Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic demonstrate that Chinese money can shape regional connectivity, linking Eastern European countries to global supply chains and giving Beijing tangible influence across the continent.
This creates an interesting contrast with U.S. sanctions. While sanctions rely on limiting actions and creating compliance, Chinese investments offer rewards and tangible improvements, which often earn goodwill from both governments and citizens. European countries, especially in the East, can leverage Chinese funds to advance development projects that might otherwise be delayed due to limited domestic resources or EU budget restrictions, which makes China a partner who delivers practical outcomes rather than just issuing political demands.
Yet the presence of Chinese money complicates European alignment with the U.S. For example, some Eastern European countries have welcomed Chinese investment even while formally supporting EU sanctions on Russia. This creates tension because Washington expects full solidarity, but Beijing provides a visible alternative path. This dual influence highlights a fundamental question. Are European states more tied to U.S. sanctions for security reasons or to China's money for economic development? And how do governments weigh political loyalty against economic opportunity in practice?
And that tension is visible in public opinion as well. Many European citizens support sanctions against Russia for moral or security reasons, yet they also welcome the benefits of Chinese investment in their own cities and regions. Local businesses often favor Chinese trade deals because they stimulate growth, while politicians have to navigate both domestic expectations and international obligations. This delicate balance shows that influence is rarely absolute and that both punishment and reward coexist in shaping European policy.
Another point to consider is long-term strategic influence. U.S. sanctions are meant to pressure Russia, but they also create dependence on Washington for economic relief and political support. Countries in Europe may feel compelled to follow American directives, but this dependence is often seen as restrictive. Chinese investment, by contrast, offers autonomy in the short term because countries can accept funds without heavy political conditions. Yet this may create subtle obligations to Beijing over time, especially if debt repayment or infrastructure contracts favor Chinese companies.
So Europe provides a nuanced case study. On one hand, the US uses sanctions as a coercive tool to ensure security and uphold alliances. On the other, China uses investment as an attractive incentive to gain influence. The resulting landscape is mixed. Western Europe tends to align more with US policies due to historical alliances and security concerns, while Eastern Europe often finds Chinese money tempting because it brings visible development and economic growth. This split illustrates how different methods of influence can coexist within the same continent.
And the final question is critical. Which method builds more lasting loyalty? Sanctions tie countries to rules and alliances, but they can generate resentment if costs are high. Money builds dependency, but also gratitude and tangible benefits. Europe shows both mechanisms at work simultaneously, and governments must constantly calculate risks, benefits, and reputational effects when deciding whether to prioritize U.S. alignment or Chinese cooperation. The contest between control and incentive is therefore most vivid here in Europe.
Ultimately, the European case demonstrates that influence is multidimensional. Security concerns, economic needs, historical alliances, and political calculations all intersect. US sanctions and Chinese investment each have their advantages and limitations, and the effectiveness of either tool depends on context, timing, and the willingness of governments to adapt. For many European states, navigating between these two powers is a daily balancing act, revealing the subtle complexities of 21st century geopolitics.
While U.S. sanctions are often seen as a primary tool of American influence, they are not without significant risks and unintended consequences. In many cases, sanctions are designed to pressure governments into changing behavior, yet they sometimes backfire by pushing countries closer to rivals like China or Russia. When nations feel threatened by U.S. policies, they seek alternatives to maintain economic stability and political autonomy, which can weaken Washington's leverage. For example, countries like Iran and Venezuela have faced decades of sanctions, limiting access to international banking and trade. Instead of capitulating, these nations turned to non-U.S. partners for economic support. China offered loans, trade agreements, and technology cooperation, while Russia provided energy deals or political backing. These relationships reduced the effectiveness of U.S. sanctions, demonstrating that coercion can inadvertently strengthen rival alliances and foster resilience against American pressure. Another issue arises from the economic and humanitarian impact of sanctions. By restricting access to global markets, sanctions often hurt ordinary citizens more than ruling elites, creating resentment toward the United States while failing to achieve political change. This can erode America's image abroad, turning moral authority into perceived hostility. Countries subjected to sanctions may respond by diversifying their partners, accelerating trade with China, Russia, or other emerging economies, thereby reducing U.S. influence over time.
This brings us to a critical global development: the effort by some countries to reduce reliance on the US dollar. For decades, the dollar has been the dominant global currency for trade, finance, and reserves, giving the United States significant power. Sanctions leverage this dominance by controlling access to dollar-based systems. However, countries targeted by sanctions are increasingly seeking alternatives, using currencies like the euro, yuan, or local digital currencies to bypass US controls and continue trading without American interference. Russia provides a clear example. After sanctions following the annexation of Crimea and other geopolitical conflicts, Moscow actively promoted non-dollar trade with China and Europe. China's yuan and barter-based arrangements became tools to maintain trade flows, bypassing dollar-denominated systems. Similarly, countries in the Middle East and Africa are exploring alternative payment methods to reduce dependence on US banks. These measures gradually erode the unique leverage of the dollar, challenging the historical effectiveness of sanctions.
Sanctions also face the problem of enforcement. The U.S. relies on allies to implement restrictions, yet global compliance is inconsistent. Some countries secretly circumvent sanctions for economic benefit or political strategy. This creates loopholes that diminish their power. The more alternatives nations develop, including regional financial systems or bilateral trade agreements outside U.S. oversight, the more sanctions lose their bite. In effect, their influence diminishes as countries build networks beyond Washington's control.
Another dimension is technological and energy independence. Countries like Iran and Russia are investing heavily in domestic technology, energy, and manufacturing to reduce vulnerability to sanctions. By creating self-sufficient systems, they lessen the pressure that US policies are meant to exert. At the same time, China is eager to fill any gaps, providing finance, technology, and infrastructure, further weakening the coercive effect of sanctions and demonstrating that economic isolation may no longer be as potent as it once was.
The diplomatic costs of sanctions are also significant. Countries pressured to comply may still resent the U.S. creating friction even among allies. European nations often have to balance sanctions against Russia with their own economic interests, such as energy imports and trade partnerships. This balancing act can lead to divided policies, uneven enforcement, or delays, all of which reduce the overall effectiveness of sanctions. The power of the tool depends not only on economic leverage, but also on international cohesion, which is increasingly difficult to maintain.
So the question emerges, are US sanctions losing their power as more countries trade outside dollar-based systems and seek alternatives? Evidence suggests a gradual erosion of influence. While sanctions remain a tool for expressing disapproval or punishing specific actions, their ability to reshape global behavior is declining. Countries are learning to diversify partners, currencies, and trade routes, reducing their dependence on Washington and strengthening ties with China, Russia, or regional blocs.
The ultimate challenge is that sanctions may create short-term compliance, but they rarely build lasting alliances. They can achieve immediate objectives, such as freezing assets or restricting exports, yet in the long term, they risk alienating targeted nations and driving them toward alternatives that weaken American influence. The rising global efforts to bypass U.S. financial control demonstrate that reliance on sanctions alone may be an unsustainable strategy in an increasingly multipolar world.
At the same time, the United States retains unmatched global financial power, and sanctions are still effective in certain contexts, particularly where countries have few alternatives or deep ties to the dollar system. The tension, however, is growing. The more nations find ways to circumvent sanctions through new partnerships or currencies, the less universally effective they become. The US must therefore consider combining sanctions with incentives, diplomacy, or economic engagement to maintain influence in the 21st century.
Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East all reveal the limitations of sanctions. Countries are adapting, diversifying, and sometimes even benefiting by forming new partnerships with China or Russia. This demonstrates that while sanctions remain an important instrument, they are no longer a guaranteed path to control. Their power is relative and diminishing as the global economy becomes more interconnected and multipolar, and as alternative financial and trade systems gain strength.
In summary, sanctions are a double-edged sword. They can signal American resolve, punish misbehavior, and maintain moral authority. but they also carry risks of backfiring, fostering resentment, and driving nations into alternative alliances. The rise of non-dollar trade and Chinese economic influence is challenging the historical dominance of sanctions, forcing the United States to rethink how it wields financial pressure in a world that is increasingly resistant to unilateral control. While China's economic influence has grown rapidly, it is not without risks and criticisms. One major concern is the concept of debt trap diplomacy, where countries take large loans from China for infrastructure projects and struggle to repay them. Critics argue that this can undermine sovereignty as Beijing gains leverage over key assets or political decisions, leading some to question whether Chinese money is truly a partnership or a strategic tool for control. For example, in Sri Lanka, the Hambantota port was leased to China for 99 years after the government struggled to repay loans for its construction. This case is often cited as a cautionary tale. What initially seemed like development aid turned into long-term Chinese control of a strategic asset. Similar concerns exist in Africa and Asia, where heavy borrowing could place governments under pressure to align policies with Beijing's interests, potentially limiting national autonomy and decision-making freedom.
Beyond financial concerns, there have been social and political consequences. In several countries, Chinese projects have sparked protests from local communities who feel excluded or exploited. Issues include the displacement of residents, lack of local employment, environmental degradation, or perceived favoritism toward Chinese companies. Citizens often feel that their governments prioritized foreign investment over local welfare, generating resentment that undermines the very goodwill China hopes to create.
In Malaysia, for instance, public outcry emerged over large-scale projects financed by Chinese loans, with citizens fearing that the debt burden outweighed the economic benefits. Protests and political debates highlighted how even well-intentioned investments can backfire if local populations perceive a lack of transparency or fairness. This demonstrates that money alone cannot guarantee loyalty. Perception and social impact play a critical role in shaping long-term relationships.
Another risk is financial sustainability. Many nations taking Chinese loans face challenges in repayment, especially when projects underperform or global economic conditions change. If revenues from infrastructure, trade, or resource exploitation do not meet expectations, debt levels can become unmanageable. This exposes governments to economic stress, forcing them to renegotiate terms or cede control over strategic sectors, which fuels criticism that China prioritizes leverage over genuine partnership.
Some analysts argue that these risks reveal a broader pattern. While Chinese loans stimulate growth in the short term, they may create dependency in the long term. Countries may feel obligated to align politically with Beijing to secure favorable terms or defer repayment. This raises ethical and strategic questions. Is China genuinely helping develop economies, or is it strategically building influence and control under the guise of partnership and cooperation?
As we reach the conclusion of today's discussion, it is important to recognize the enduring strength of U.S. sanctions as a tool of influence. Sanctions leverage America's control over global financial systems, particularly the U.S. dollar, and can create real pressure on governments and corporations. By restricting access to banking, markets, and critical technology, the U.S. can signal consequences for unwanted behavior, maintaining a form of global oversight that few other countries can match.
Sanctions are particularly effective when nations are deeply integrated into the global economy and depend on U.S. financial networks. They can halt trade, freeze assets, and create diplomatic isolation. In addition, sanctions demonstrate political resolve, sending a clear message about what actions the international community finds unacceptable. The ability to enforce these measures consistently reinforces the perception of American power and maintains alliances built on shared security and economic interests.
However, as we discussed in earlier sections, sanctions also have limits. They can backfire, pushing countries toward alternative partners like China or Russia, and sometimes harm ordinary citizens more than elites. Enforcement requires cooperation from allies, and as more nations trade outside dollar-based systems, the power of sanctions may gradually decline. This raises important questions about whether sanctions alone are sufficient to maintain long-term global influence.
On the other side, China's money demonstrates a different kind of influence, based on incentive rather than coercion. Through investment, loans, trade deals, and the Belt and Road Initiative, China has built tangible relationships with countries across Africa, Asia, Europe, and beyond. By providing resources, infrastructure, and immediate economic benefits, China has created goodwill, strengthened partnerships, and positioned itself as a key development partner, often in ways that are highly visible and appreciated by local populations.
Chinese financial influence allows countries to pursue projects they could not afford independently, creating jobs, improving infrastructure, and integrating regions into global supply chains. Unlike sanctions, which punish, Chinese money encourages cooperation and dependency in a way that is perceived as mutually beneficial. Governments that accept Chinese loans often see short-term growth and political support, which can translate into stronger alignment with Beijing's interests over time.
Yet China's approach is not without risk. Critics highlight concerns about debt dependency, sovereignty, environmental impact, and local backlash. While Chinese investment can buy temporary alignment, public protests and financial strain can undermine long-term loyalty. Questions remain whether these relationships create genuine, lasting influence or merely short-term deals that benefit elites while exposing countries to future obligations and strategic leverage from Beijing.
Reflecting on both approaches, it is clear that U.S. sanctions and Chinese money serve very different purposes. Sanctions are about control, limiting behavior, and signaling consequences, whereas Chinese investment is about building incentives, creating tangible benefits, and fostering economic dependency. Each tool has its strengths and weaknesses, and their effectiveness depends heavily on context, regional dynamics, and the strategic choices of targeted nations.
The question of who wins is therefore not straightforward. The real outcome may depend on global shifts, alliances, and the evolving international order. If nations increasingly diversify their partners and seek alternatives to US dominance, the influence of sanctions may wane. Conversely, if China faces debt crises, political pushback, or strategic challenges, the durability of its monetary influence may be tested. The global game is dynamic, and neither side holds absolute advantage.
Europe, Africa, and Asia-Pacific all show that influence is complex. Countries weigh both carrots and sticks, sometimes embracing one, sometimes balancing both. The U.S. retains the ability to punish, while China continues to offer economic incentives. In practice, nations often navigate between these pressures to maximize their own benefits, illustrating that the effectiveness of sanctions or money depends on local needs, opportunities, and long-term strategic calculations.
In the end, the lesson is that sanctions punish, money builds, but which one lasts longer is uncertain. Sanctions can create compliance quickly, but may breed resentment or drive countries to alternative partners. Chinese investment can generate goodwill and dependence, yet may be challenged by financial, social, or political constraints. The ultimate winner may be determined less by immediate power and more by who can sustain influence over decades while adapting to changing global conditions.
For policymakers, investors, and observers, this means that neither tool can be used in isolation. A combination of incentives, diplomacy, security, and selective sanctions may be necessary to maintain influence effectively. As the international system evolves, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of both U.S. and Chinese strategies is essential to navigating global power dynamics and anticipating how alliances, loyalties, and economic dependencies will shift in the years ahead.
For our listeners, the takeaway is that the global competition between US sanctions and China's money is not a simple win or lose scenario. Influence comes in many forms, and each approach has consequences for countries, economies, and citizens. As we observe these strategies unfold, we gain insight into the complex balance of power shaping the 21st century. The ultimate question remains: will punishment or incentive prove more enduring in shaping global behavior?
And with that, we conclude our in-depth analysis of today's topic. We hope this discussion has provided perspective on how sanctions and financial incentives operate in different regions, the risks and benefits of each approach, and the ongoing struggle for influence in a rapidly changing world. The global game continues, and only time will reveal which strategy truly proves more effective in the long run.
Thank you for joining us on this journey. Remember to reflect on the differences between control and reward, punishment and incentive. As global citizens, understanding these tools helps us see not just the surface of diplomacy, but the underlying strategies shaping nations, economies, and alliances. Whether sanctions or money ultimately prevail, the world is watching, and so are we.